Hello, everyone. Derek Barefoot here on the Typologetics YouTube channel with my wife May again. It's going to help do some reading for us tonight. Please give us your likes, your comments, and questions. Don't forget to subscribe. We've been looking at the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection. We did a quick through way back many weeks ago, and now we've been going through these accounts in more detail, comparing them closely, and we've reached the fourth gospel, John's gospel, and we're going to start that tonight. Let's open with prayer. So, Father, please give us hearts to understand your word and to apply it. Give us discernment in all things by your spirit of truth. Amen. All right. So we finished up Luke. We saw that strong focus on Jerusalem, the fact that the resurrection of Jesus relocated the disciples in Jerusalem for their ministry that was to follow, as recorded in the book of Acts, and that Luke had done considerable shaping because of that, the importance of that role for Jerusalem in the early ministry of the apostles. So John has his own concerns and his own perspective to present of the resurrection appearances. So let's go to John chapter 20 and start reading. May's here ready to read for us. May, let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 5 of John 20.
Okay. Now, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came early to the tomb, while it was still dark, and saw the stone already taken away from the tomb. So she ran and came to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved, and said to them, "They have taken away the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." So Peter and the other disciple went forth, and they were going to the tomb. The two were running together, and the other disciple ran ahead faster than Peter, and came to the tomb first. And stooping and looking in, he saw the linen wrapping lying there, but he did not go in.
Okay, thank you. So right away, as we've seen before, there are important similarities, but some very distinct differences between John's account and what we've been reading in the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The account is framed the same way in that as it begins, we find Mary Magdalene. Now, in the other accounts, we had more than one woman. In Matthew, we had two. In Mark, we had, I believe it was three. In Luke, there were two or more. I'd have to look back and see now, but we had more than one woman, excuse me, in those other accounts that went to the tomb. But Mary Magdalene was always in the lead. Mary Magdalene is the principal among these women in all cases. And so here it just mentions her. That does not exclude the possibility of other women being with her, of course. Even though they are not mentioned. In fact, it is unlikely that a woman like Mary Magdalene would go while it's still dark out to a graveyard in Jerusalem by herself. It seems unlikely, but she's the principal. That's the link in all the accounts, and it opens the same way that she's going to the tomb and finding the stone has been moved away from the entrance. There are more ways to tell a story, even the same story, than people usually think there are. And there would be many other ways to frame this account other than this trip of a woman or women to the tomb early on the first day of the week. In Mark's long ending, so that added ending to Mark, for example, it says, when Jesus rose on the first day of the week, he appeared to Mary Magdalene. That is an example of a completely different way to frame the beginning of the story. Of course, it provides less detail about the beginning, but there are any number of ways that you can start into this. So this is something that's distinctively similar with all the accounts. However, there is an additional trip here. It says that when she saw the stone rolled away, she seems to have assumed that the body has been taken out. It doesn't say that she looked inside. And interestingly enough, it does say that the beloved disciple stoops and looks inside to see the linen wrappings. Mary just seems to assume, because the tomb is open, that the body of Jesus has been taken out. And there are explanations of why this might have happened. We won't go into them. There are cultural explanations, plausible explanations, why a body of someone who's crucified might have been moved out of a tomb like this, that was intended for Jews in good standing in the community. But in any case, she is distraught because she believes this has happened, that someone has disturbed the tomb for the purpose of taking Jesus' body out of it. And she goes and tells Peter and the beloved disciple. Now remember, in Luke records that Peter went and looked, but after the women had come and reported a vision of angels that had given them the message that Jesus had risen. So there can't have been two trips of Peter to the tomb to find it empty and to inspect it. This has to be the same trip, but we find a different ordering or arrangement of events, because there's absolutely no reason given here to believe that Mary has seen or heard from angels at this point, just that the tomb has been disturbed. And assuming that there is some truth being revealed in John, it means that Mark has telescoped some of the events. Remember, Mark says the women arrived, saw the stone rolled away, looked inside, and then a young man was there with a message, and then they flee in fear from the tomb and say nothing. Well, here it reveals that there are, there's a more complicated sequence that must have happened. Let's go ahead. We're not going to read this, all the accounts of John tonight. Let's go ahead so we can see the next thing that happens with Mary. We've got Peter and the beloved disciple. As in Luke, Peter sees that there are grave clothes there, but Jesus is not there. So May, would you go ahead and read verses, say, 6 through 13 for us now?
And so Simon Peter also came, following him, and entered the tomb. And he saw the linen wrappings lying there, and the face cloth which had been on his head, not lying with the linen wrappings, but rolled up in a place by itself. So the other disciple who had first come to the tomb then also entered, and he saw and believed. For as yet they did not understand the scripture, that he must rise again from the dead. So the disciples went away again to their own homes. But Mary was standing outside the tomb weeping. And so, as she wept, she stooped and looked into the tomb. And she saw two angels in white sitting, one at the head and one at the feet, where the body of Jesus had been lying. And they said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" She said to them, "Because they have taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him."
Okay, so we can stop there. So you'll notice here there's a common perspective between John and Mark that is different from Matthew and Luke. And it is this, that in Matthew and Luke, there is a little more, as I've said, that you see this in Matthew especially, but in both of those Gospels, there is a little sunnier, shall we say, or a more sympathetic portrait of the disciples. And in both Matthew and Luke, When the women encounter angels at the tomb, it results in their immediate belief, as we have it in Matthew. It says that they ran to give the disciples, and it says they had fear, but it was accompanied by joy. They could only have joy if they believed the angelic message that Jesus had risen. So the women believe immediately in Matthew. Likewise in Luke, the women encounter the angels at the tomb. They bow to them, recognizing them to be supernatural personages. They receive the message and eagerly go and convey it to the disciples. So the women believe right away. Here, you'll notice that as in Mark, there is not immediate belief. In other words, Mary clearly is confused, whatever Peter and the beloved disciple may have disclosed to her. The only thing that she seems to still be aware of is that Jesus is not in the tomb, and this is just adding confusion and disturbance to the grief she already felt. And in verse 12, when she sees two angels, and again, there are two, as in Luke, instead of one, as in Mark and Matthew, but she sees two of them. She sees where the body of Jesus had been lying. And there, remember back in Mark, the angel says, look and see where he was lying. So without the instruction, it says she noted that where the place where the body had been. And they say to her, woman, why are you weeping? And she still says that she believes that someone has taken the Lord's body away. At this point, Mary is obviously feeling confusion and continued grief. Obviously, if she recognizes the angels as being angels, it does not alleviate her grief or confusion. And this is quite similar actually to Mark. Remember, it says in Mark that the angel said, Jesus is not here, he's risen, he's gone ahead into Galilee, but the women leave gripped with fear. It says they were in fear, they told no one. That's as they're leaving the tomb. Well, they're fleeing from the tomb. Here, Mary is just lingering near the tomb. But the upshot of it is that she sees something extraordinary inside. She sees where Jesus' body has been laid, as in Mark, and sees that he is not there. And her response is not immediate belief. It's just a compounded negative emotion. She's still grief-stricken, but confused. We could assume that there would be fear mixed with this. She's afraid for what's happened to Jesus. It's a rush of emotions. And although Mark puts the dramatic note of sort of fleeing from the tomb, the basics of the account are similar in that respect. And we have to note this, that in Matthew and in Luke, as I noted first about Matthew, now I think we have to say about Luke too, that the belief of the women had been moved up to when they encountered the angelic vision at the tomb. In other words, Matthew and Luke, the women come to believe. The women come to believe. And Matthew and Luke have simply moved that belief up in time to, when they first encounter this, they have this angelic encounter at the empty tomb and located it there. Mark and now John tell us, well, it wasn't quite as simple as that. The women did not immediately believe, but they believed soon, as we'll see here as we continue to read. What we might gather in a larger picture is that the women were, or women or woman, because in John we have just Mary named. There's a slight hint in the way she talks that we do not, there's a slight hint that there may be other women with her, but it's not clear that they are. But a woman or women were the first to go to the tomb, the first to find the tomb empty, and the first to believe that Jesus is risen. So in Matthew and Mark just kind of put an exclamation point on that. The women were not only the first to go and see, but the first to believe. But that is something that's common to all the accounts. So May, if you would go ahead and read now. So we see that Mary is still grief stricken. So let's go ahead and read verses 14 through 16.
Okay. When she had said this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing there and did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to her, "Woman, why are you weeping? Whom are you seeking?" Supposing him to be the gardener, she said to him, "Sir, if you have carried him away, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away." Jesus said to her, "Mary." She turned and said to him in Hebrew, "Rabboni," which means teacher.
Okay, so here Mary has recognized Jesus, and at this point, we realize that because she's addressed him as Rabboni, as exalted teacher, she's obviously believing. She recognizes Jesus. So she is believing now that Jesus is alive. So this happens soon after she leaves the tomb. That's something we could infer from, remember from Mark, we said the women would have had to believe in order to relate, their vision, and for the male disciples to be in any position to follow Jesus' instructions, to go to Galilee. We know the male disciples came to believe because we wouldn't have the story of the transfiguration. Jesus said, "Don't reveal it till the Son of Man is raised." So in Mark, we could have inferred the early belief of the women. In Matthew and Luke, we have the early belief of the women. Now, the message of the angels, there isn't really a message that is disclosed in John, but if you look up in verse 13, where May read earlier, the angels say to her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" There is a common thread between the angelic messages, all right? And that is that the messages, the elaborate messages we get in Mark and Matthew about, go to Galilee, there you'll see him, as he said. Jesus had told them earlier, according to Mark and Matthew, he told the disciples earlier that when he rose, he would go ahead of them into Galilee. So there was a confirmation of that in Mark and Matthew at the tomb. In Luke, you remember they say, "Why are you looking for the living one among the dead?" That if you're looking for a living Lord, a graveyard is not the right place to look for him. That, is that living people don't stay, in graveyards. Jesus he's not only alive, but he's moving ahead. He's going ahead to lead his church. Now, that is, we get that message from Luke, likewise, that he's living and active, so there wouldn't be cause for grief. Here, the angelic message, by asking her, "Woman, why are you weeping?" There's a clear implication. Woman, you don't need to be weeping. You weep for someone who's dead. If you serve a living Lord, he's not dead. There's a lot wrapped up just in the question. In fact, it says to her, grief is not appropriate. And by implication, it's not appropriate for Jesus to be in the grave because he is now alive. So there's more in common with these messages than, might first strike us, give us the first impression, because the verbiage is different, but behind them, the thought is very similar. Jesus is not here. Jesus is living and active and leading once again. And I thought I would take a few minutes before we move on, because we've got quite a bit more to say about John, and we'll continue with it next week, on what I've said before about the great freedom of the evangelists to shape their narrative. And we can see that from other parts of the Gospels and comparing them, so that sort of the disparate the differences that we get in some of the details here, because of the way the story is being told, are more understandable in light of the liberties that the evangelists are allowed to take under inspiration. As believers, we have to believe that inspiration allowed and used this. But let's take a look at an earlier example. So I want to look at something earlier in the Gospels that shows you how free they were to, as I say, to reshape the narrative. So let's go back and start this time with a miracle of Jesus that we find back in Mark chapter 5. So Mark 5, and we'll look at starting in verse 21. We're not going to read this whole account because Mark has a 23 verse long narrative here, pericope, as it's called, an item of narrative in the Gospels, but we'll get the gist of it. So May, if you would read verses 21 through 24.
Okay. When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and so he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, and on seeing him, fell at his feet, and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and praising on him.
Okay, so you get the picture. This synagogue ruler, we are probably in Capernaum. It does not say directly what the village is. It's probably Capernaum. He says, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come lay your hands on her so she will get well and live." Jesus was known for healings. We've already had that in Mark. So, desperate father, it's natural that putting some faith in reports he's heard about Jesus' healing abilities comes to him for this purpose. And Jesus, as he's crossing the village to get to the sick girl, he encounters a woman with a continuing hemorrhage or flow of blood. He has an encounter with her. She is healed by touching the hem of Jesus' garment. So we're not going to read all these events, but if we go down to verse 35, as Jesus is finishing the encounter with this woman that he has on the way to the girl's house, notice what happens. May, if you would read verse 35 now.
Just 35?
Yes, 35.
While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?"
Okay, so you get this? As Jesus is, I don't know, halfway across the village, whatever it might be, on his way to the house, if he has not arrived there, there are messengers that come from the house where the girl is that say, tell the Jairus, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" Why do they say this? Because Jesus is not known as someone who raises the dead. He's someone who heals sickness. Now, immediately we'll think, yes, there are 3 occasions on which Jesus did raise the dead, as recorded in the Gospels. We've got 3 of those instances. Jesus spoke about raising the dead to some representatives of John the Baptist who arrived on one occasion. We won't look at those scriptures. Jesus told his disciples even to raise the dead. I won't go into great detail about this, but Jesus, when he talked about the dead rising, normally it was in one of 3 ways, 3 primary ways. Either he was talking about his own rising from the dead and predicting that. He was talking about the general resurrection of the dead at the end of the age, which he mentioned several times. Or he was talking about raising people out of spiritual death and out of despair and hopelessness, of a death-like condition rather than literal death. Those are most of the ways that he uses that. in fact, and I think a couple of them that's not normally recognized. He's actually using it as raising people out of spiritual death and despair and so on. But he does have those three actual literal resurrections. They were the daughter of Jairus, which Jesus goes ahead to the house and then raises the little girl. We don't want to keep you in suspense if you don't know. I think most of us know this story. But there's the young man who's the son of the widow of Nain, and then finally Lazarus near the end of Jesus' ministry. There are those three, but those are very much considered as exceptional, surprising, even shocking, not the general course of what Jesus was expected to do by people. You know, it says that people would bring Jesus, people on cots, like the young man who was paralyzed, is lowered down through the roof. They wouldn't bring Jesus corpses to have him raise them. That was just something under very exceptional, rare, unusual circumstances that would happen, not something he would be routinely expected to do. But now let's take a look at Matthew's version of this. And to do that, we need to go to Matthew chapter 9. So Matthew chapter 9, we're going to look at verse 18.
Just 18.
Yeah, you can read just 18.
While he was saying these things to them, a synagogue official came and bowed down before him and said, "My daughter has just died, but come and lay your hand on her, and she will live."
Okay, this is the same account. This is Matthew's version of this account. He does not name the official Jairus, but this is that account. If you keep reading it, Jesus encounters the woman with a flow of blood, and the next, and then arrives at the house. But in this case, he says, "My daughter has just died. Come and put your hands on her, and she will live." Well, as I say, this is illogical. It's illogical in the overall context that Jesus was not routinely expected to raise the dead. And the other thing was, it's illogical in view of Mark's narrative. You can tell when the messengers come and they say, "Don't bother the teacher. Your daughter's died. Why bother the teacher anymore?" It's taken for granted that if she has died, the window of opportunity has passed for Jesus to do anything for her. But in Matthew's version, we don't have the arrival of the messengers. We have a greatly abbreviated encounter with the woman for the hemorrhage. And Jesus does arrive at the house, as in Mark. He raises the girl, but it occupies is less than half the space. What Matthew has done is he desires to tell a short form of this miracle. And in order to do that, he just does not want to bother with the narrative details of the messengers coming, saying the girl has died. So he just has the father say, "My daughter's died," and Jesus goes and resurrects her. The point is still the same. Matthew wants to deliver the point that Jesus raises this young girl from the dead. He gets that across, and he's just not concerned with either providing all the details or resolving the little logical problem of this man asking Jesus to raise the dead. Matthew's just not troubled by that. You'll find that in Matthew's gospel, he's mostly concerned about the large blocks of teaching. That's what he's most interested in, not the dramatic scenes. That Mark, actually, the stories that are in common between Mark and Matthew, Mark normally has the longer and more detailed, more colorful version, and Matthew usually abbreviates those. And the reason his gospel is longer is because all the teaching, the blocks of teaching, as well as we've got an infancy story and more about the resurrection on the ends of Matthew, also making it longer. But it's just that the emphasis is not so much on those that narrative color and detail. But the reason I wanted to cite this is to show how much liberty. Remember, we saw this with the fig tree too earlier, that Matthew has the fig tree withered right in front, dramatically right in front of the disciples, and that he abbreviates the chronology of Jesus' arrival in Jerusalem. And the point I wanted to make is that all the evangelists, in fact, are capable of doing this kind of rearranging, even doing some rewording of Jesus, and yet still preserving sort of the pith and the most important points as they see them of what they are relating. And so when we get the differences in the messages of the angels and those kind of differences, that all falls within this elasticity, we might say, that the narrative has in the hands of the evangelists. I'll give you two very quick examples because our time is about up for now. But Luke rearranges the order of the call of the disciples. In Mark, Jesus calls the disciples, Andrew, Peter, James, and John, then goes into Capernaum, teaches in the synagogue, and as he's teaching, a man with a demon shouts out, and Jesus casts out the demon and then goes to Peter's house where his mother-in-law is sick and she heals him. Luke rearranges that order. Luke has Jesus teach at the synagogue, cast the demon out of the man who shouts in the synagogue. Then he goes to Peter's house, heals the mother-in-law, and then he calls the disciples away from their fishing boats, and they follow him. We find that the order of Jesus' temptations, as another example, is different in Luke and Matthew. The two are reversed in one versus the other. And one last one is where Mark and Matthew have Jesus during the Olivet Discourse say that the disciples should look out for when the abomination of desolation or destruction is standing in the holy place. Okay, that's the way we have it in Mark and Matthew. It's sort of cryptic, a little bit mysterious what is being said. We're supposed to look in Daniel and sort of figure that out. Luke simply tells us it's when armies surround Jerusalem. Jerusalem, the holy city, when it's surrounded by armies, presumably this would be Gentile armies, so they're unholy, they're something that causes destruction, they're an abomination in that respect. So Luke rewords in order to make Jesus' words less mysterious, to kind of clue us in on what they mean. We saw Matthew did that with the question about the loaf, what Jesus meant by the leaven of the Pharisees. Matthew interprets that for us. So that's what I mean by this, by these liberties that they're allowed to take, but it doesn't mean that they can just say anything and just making up just anything as they go along. They're choosing to provide their own emphasis and to choose events, even doing some reordering of events. I think that reordering in this case is probably more on the Luke's side than on John's side, but in any case, that's not something that is completely surprising. It just falls within the evangelist's methods. So we're going to continue with John next time. We've come to the end for tonight. Thank you for joining us. Let's close with prayer. So, Father, we thank you for what we've been able to read and study tonight. And we thank you for the gift of faith. Please continue to guide us and keep us in your care till we're together again. Amen.
Amen.
And we'll see you next time.